Fathers can be as loath to part with their daughters as mothers so often are loath to part with their sons. And so it was when Olwen, the daughter of Ysbaddaden Pencara, went to him and said she had fallen in love and wished to marry, that her father, a monstrously large giant, were far, far, far bigger than Olwen herself, who was of normal proportions. Ysbaddaden roared and raged and thundered and stomped and stamped, for he had spent many a long year trying to ensure that his daughter would never fall in love and never marry. He had kept her isolated and separated and filled her heads with tales of how awful men were and how terrible and abusive and exploitative, and convinced himself that he had poisoned her against all possibility of love. But Olwen had remained inured to her father's schemes. And it has to be said that Ysbaddaden's concern for his daughter was not simply a father's possessiveness, a father's anxiety that once his daughter is off and married, he may see very little of her. Rather, it was also, perhaps almost entirely, based upon a great fear that the giant had, fear of a prophecy that said, on the day his daughter married, he himself would die. And so that was the true reason why he had tried to keep her so isolated in the castle and so poisoned against the possibility of love and romance and men. But, as others have found, when you try to hold back the tide or redirect the winds, nature has a way of bursting forth, and love is as much a force of nature as is the ocean wave, as is the great whipping winds of the sky. And love found its way. In time, Culhwch, a brave and bold young man, a warrior from the courts of King Arthur, clapped eyes upon Olwen, and she clapped eyes upon him, and one thing led to another, and the two of them fell madly, hopelessly in love. And when suitor and bride-to-be went to break the news to the monstrous giant who was her father, and he roared and he raged and he raved and he stomped until the castle walls themselves shook, he did eventually concede that this marriage could take place if and only if this putative son-in-law were to complete 7 seemingly impossible tasks. And the tale of how young Culhwch managed, with the aid of his friends and companions, as is only right and proper, to complete these bizarre and quite ridiculous tasks, 6 of them at least, is a story for another day. For this particular story is how he completed 1 task. And the task was this. The giant, of enormous proportions, the size of a mighty tree, head scraping the sky, had a beard, and that beard went all the way from his chin down to the very floor itself, and continued on dragging across the floor for another 12 yards. And that beard, as it trailed across the floor, picked up every leaf and twig and insect and dust and dirt and splatters of food that you could possibly imagine it would, and into it came to live squirrels and birds and badgers and well, all manner of beasts made their home in the filthy, matted, tangled, knotted beard that grew from his face. And those creatures, of course, leave their own detritus behind, and that encrusted in the beard as well. And Ysbaddaden said that, much as he had no wish to see his daughter married, if it were to be, then he would, on the day of her wedding, and which was of course also the day of his death, look his very best. He wanted his beard and his hair to be neat and trimmed and cleaned. And of course, being a monstrous giant with everything so much thicker than normal, including the hairs that grew from his face, a mere ordinary pair of scissors could not cut them. A mere ordinary comb could not untangle and unknot such a morass. It required a truly magical pair of shears to snip away at such a beard, and a truly magical comb to get the knots and the filth and the grime out. And such a pair of scissors, such a comb, he said, existed already. They were to be found tucked into the bristles growing between the ears of the king of the boars. And just as Uspathaden Pankara himself was the king of the giants, so this king of the boars, Trochtreth by name, was enormous, monstrously large, 10 times larger than any wild boar has a right to be. And he was possessed of 7 children. And each of these 7 children was, whilst smaller than himself, nonetheless massively large in comparison to any other wild boar, and fierce and dangerous and brutal with it. Well, Culhwch was besides himself for knowing how to resolve this situation. Olwen wept and sobbed, feeling that her beloved would never be able to find these shears and this comb, and that if he even tried, the boar would rip him limb from limb. But Culhwch had tried and tested the friendship of his companions and found them clever and fierce and loyal and cunning and resourceful, and so he turned to them again, including to the king of the Isle of the Mighty himself, to King Arthur, and said to him, "Have you heard of this boar? Do you know where we might find it and how we might tackle it?" And Arthur said he had indeed heard of this boar, and rumour had it that the boar lived in Ireland, causing no end of mayhem and chaos over the ocean waves in Ireland itself. But he had never heard tell that there was a comb or scissors between its ears, and so they turned to one of the wizards of the court, to Menw, and asked him if he would go and find out. And Menw weaved his magic as only a druid can, and transformed himself into a bird, and he flew across the waves that separate Britain from Ireland, and over Ireland he flew round and round and round, until at length he spotted down below, after many and many a mile of flying, the vast shape of the king of the wild boars, surrounded by the almost as vast shapes of his 7 sons and daughters. And there the bird alighted between the ears of that monstrous beast, and saw there indeed was a comb tucked into the bristles, ornate and beautiful and wonderfully made, a thing of magic, carved with own letters and all sorts of strange arcane symbols. And there also tucked into the bristles was a mighty pair of shears, the sort of thing you might use to shear a giant sheep, or indeed the beard of a massive giant. And the little bird that was Menw tried to pluck at the comb to pull it out and fly away with it, because, after all, why go to all the trouble of battling a mighty boar if you can just steal the comb from between his ears whilst shape-shifted into a bird? But as much as the bird tried to tug and pull, the bird was not big enough to get the comb to come loose, and the boar began to sense the movement, the surreptitious behaviour of this tiny little bird betwixt its ears, and it shook its mighty head, and the bristles, which reeked and stank with what the bird had first thought was sweat from the boar, were actually coated in poison, and the droplets of the boar's poison flew about, and some of it splattered upon Menw's wings, and he shrieked with the agony of this coruscating acidic poison burning into him, and flew back to Britain to report on what he had found. But even when he transformed himself back into a human, the poison had burnt and disfigured him and left him with terrible scars upon his body. And from that day till the day he died, he was never quite the same man again. But at least he completed his duty and reported that there was indeed a boar, and where that boar was to be found in Ireland, and that the comb and the scissors were between the boar's ears. And so Arthur said that whilst Menw should stay at home and recuperate from his poisoning, that he and Culhwch and the mightiest of the warriors of the court of the Island of the Mighty should set foot upon the great ship Prydwen and sail from the harbour in Wales across the ocean waves to Ireland itself. And Prydwen was a magical ship, a ship that could steer and guide itself, a ship possessed of wisdom and knowledge all of its own. And across the ocean waves they went. Arthur, Culhwch, a band of mighty fierce warriors and wizards, and their horses, and their bravest and boldest war dogs. Huge, great, fierce beasts, twice the size of an Irish wolfhound. Great, massive things with great saucer eyes and teeth like fangs like swords, I should say. Great dagger blades from their mouths. And the king of the dogs, Arthur's own loyalist beast, Cafall. Cafall, so called from the Welsh word for a horse, for Cafall was the size of a horse, a great mighty thrusting rampant stallion in his heart. In his body, Cafall was a Jack Russell, but with the fierce might and power of a stallion burning within him. And across the ocean waves they went, dogs and horses peering out over the side of the ship, Cafall tucked up in Arthur's arms, watching over the ocean wave, until at length Prydwen birthed itself in the harbour at Ireland. And the men stepped foot, and the horses stepped hoof, and the dogs stepped paw onto Irish soil. And soon they encountered Irish men and women who were at the harbour going about their own business with their fishing fleets and so forth, and surprised they were to see this arrival of so heavily armed and fierce-looking a band of warriors from foreign shores. And at first they were very suspicious, as anyone might well be, especially when they heard these strange foreign accents. But when they were told that this band of fierce warriors had come in search of subduing the mighty boar and his piglets, the Irish rejoiced, for they had long suffered under the yoke of that boar, who had uprooted fields, devastated crops leading to famine and starvation, had fought warriors and druids and anyone brave enough, bold enough or foolish enough to come and tackle them, and indeed had devoured and trampled upon anyone who simply didn't get out of its way fast enough. Corpse upon corpse upon corpse could be attributed to the king of the boars and his 7 monstrous children. Men and women and children alike, cattle and crops, devastated mile upon mile, year upon year. And so the prospect of finally being rid of them, even if it were at the hands of a foreign force, was so wonderful that the Irish rejoiced and gave every aid and direction and help and assistance to Arthur and his warriors in tracking down where the boars had wandered off to since Menw, the wizard, had last laid eyes upon them. And after many a long day of journeying deep into the heart of Ireland, there they came to a great ruined forest with trees uprooted, rivers gouted and diverted, bogs and marshes caused by the trampling of so many large hooves, or of piles of reeking effluent here, there and everywhere, until at length ahead of them, in what had once been a lush forest but now was shattered matchsticks, they saw the huge mound, like a hillside with legs, that was the king of the wild boar. And around him, 7 monstrous beasts, half his size, but still huge gargantuan creatures with tusks like swords and eyes like saucers glowering at them. And at first they tried diplomacy. They tried to call out and say, we come to trade for the comb and scissors that are between the ears of Torthreth. But either the pigs simply didn't understand them, or they cared nothing for the offers of peace. For at once all 8 beasts were upon their trotters, stamping the ground, gouging great chunks of earth out of it, oinking and snuffling and snorting, glowering and hissing and stampeding towards them, this great porcine army, intent on death and carnage. And the warriors and druids turned to their swords and their spears and their axes and their wizards' staves, casting spells hither and yon, letting rip with spears and arrows and throwing axes and daggers. Blades whipped hither and yon and found their target, but bounced off. For each of these creatures had a hide so thick that a rhinoceros would have been envious of it. And sword blades and axe blades and spear shafts made hardly any dent whatsoever in the thickness of the hide, let alone drew blood, let alone caused any noticeable pain. And when the war dogs were unleashed and leapt their teeth, sinking into pork flesh, with bites that would have taken the arms or legs off of any human being or caused the death of any normal-sized wild boar, with these gargantuan beasts they hardly scratched the surface. And some of those poor dogs succumbed to the poisonous bristles, puking their stomach in acids up and tormented and suffering terribly for days to come from having swallowed the poison that dripped off, particularly the father, the king of the wild boars. Well, day after day after day, the soldiers would gather and battle with the pigs, and then they would be routed and they'd carry off their sick and their injured horses and dogs and men alike to safer shores and tend to their wounds and come back again a day later. On and on it went, day after day after day, and some died in the process, and some were so badly injured they could never be warriors again. Some of the dogs died, some of the horses died. A carnage was terrible. On and on and on it went for a full month, working their way across Ireland. And when they came near villages, the pigs would set upon the villagers, even though they had no part to play in the battle, and they would cause death and carnage wherever they went. A terrible thing it was. Until at length they came to the ocean shore. And there the pigs were gathered, the ocean to one side of them, Arthur and the warriors of the British court to the other side. And suddenly the king of the pigs spoke. Not oinked or snuffled or growled, but spoke in the voice of a cultured Irish nobleman, and said, "Once I was a king of this land, and my sons and my daughters were princesses and princesses of this land. We ruled fiercely, we waged war upon our enemies, so much so that the people, gutless cowards that they are, turned for help to the druids who counselled us to peace, but we would have none of it, and we turned upon the druids themselves, and to that length they cast their own curses and spells upon us, and turned us from men and women into wild beasts of the forest that you see before us, saying that we were greedy hogs, relentless for gold and carnage and death, that we would root up the whole of Ireland, left to our own devices. But, Their spells benefited them none, for even in this shape we have continued to glory in battle and death. Whilst gold no longer means anything to us, we enjoy the sobs of the widows and orphans that we create. We enjoy the screaming howls of the dead and the dying and the injured. We nourish ourselves upon their broken flesh. And you, foolish, arrogant king of the Isle of the Mighty, come here to take from us that which we will not give, though it means nothing to us and benefits us none, but we will spare nothing to you or to anyone else. Well, we tell you this. We have grown tired of avenging ourselves upon the people of Ireland who turned us into this shape. And we wish now to avenge ourselves upon the people of your country, to bring death and carnage to you. And with that, the king of the wild boars turned tail and waded out into the ocean waves. And even when the boar was at a depth that would have drowned any man, even a very tall one, well, those waves barely reached to the pig's shoulders. And his 7 sons and daughters joined him, until, like a series of great islands floating out across the ocean wave, they swam and they swam and they swam their way across towards the coast of Wales. And Arthur and his court, humans and dogs and horses alike, were battered and bleeding and limping and bruised and broken and injured and splattered with the acidic poisons from the bristles of the great wild boar. But they saw the horror that lay before them, that lay before their own people. And they rode and they ran and they limped and they staggered as fast as they could the many a mile down the coast towards where Prydwen was harboured. Until several hours later, in a terrible state, they boarded the ship, and the ship itself, being a thing of magic, sailed its way across to the coast of Wales. But, of course, the pigs had had a considerable head start upon them, and by the time Prydwen sailed into the harbour in Wales, the pigs had long since been upon shore, and Arthur and his men needed to ask no one for guidance as to where they might be. They simply had to follow the trail of carnage, of the broken bodies, the shattered houses, the uprooted fields, the dead and the injured and the dying. A trail of horror lay in the wake of the king of the wild boars and his 7 sons and daughters. And Arthur and his men went as fast as they could. On foot, on horseback, on paw, they followed the trail of carnage, until at length they came to their first encounter with the pigs, who were in the middle of wreaking mayhem upon a village. And they battled with them, and fierce the battle was, very, very fierce. And the villagers fled for their own safety up into the mountains, until at last the pigs were driven on, and the men, exhausted, fell into a heap. And it was several hours before they found the strength to continue on and follow the pigs to the next location for the next site of carnage. And at each of the stopping points in the great battle, there were places where pigs routed up whole new lakes, where they flattened hillsides, where they devastated forests. There were places in the landscape that can be seen from that day to this, where the pigs caused their carnage. And there were also places where the warriors of Arthur, human or horse or hound, fell dead to the savagery of the Irish wild boars, and where their graves are marked by great standing stones. And there are places too where the sons and daughters of Turach Truith fell dead, one by one by one. Eventually the swords and spears and axes and spells of the warriors and wizards of Arthur's court finally, blow after blow after blow after blow, managing to penetrate the massive hides of those beasts and cause injuries that led to the gouting of blood and the spilling of entrails. One piglet one day and another piglet another day, one by one the piglets fell dead, and there are standing stones and markers of where those deaths also happened. And the trail may still be followed of the carnage of the pigs. Until at length Tuathail went from having 7 children to 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 to none, until he himself stood alone, the sole survivor of his monstrous and violent brood. The sounder of piglets, now silent. And it was in Powys that Arthur and those of his men who had survived, including Culhwch amongst them, and those of his horses and those of his hounds who had survived, cornered Tuathail high up in a mountain by Powys. And there they fought and they fought and they fought until they had driven the great pig back towards the edge of a precipice. And with the great drop down, down, down the side of the mountain behind the king of the wild boars and Arthur's warriors on the other side, they had hoped that they would corner this monstrous beast, push it over the edge, realising that no quantity of blows from swords and spears and axes and wizard spells would ever truly penetrate that monstrous hide to do more than the most minor of injuries and cause the most desultory dribble of blood to shed from the great beast. They thought perhaps to push it back over the cliff would be the only way to cause death, or at the very least significant injury to the monstrous thing. Maybe to be able to take the comb and the shears from between its ears if the beast lay at the very least unconscious, if not dead, at the bottom of the mountain. But even as they produced this plan, the beast rushed forward and sank its massive teeth into the neck of one of Arthur's loyalist warriors and bit off the man's head in a single snap. And Arthur, having seen death after death after death of his warriors, his friends, his companions, his beloved horses, his hounds, was so enraged, so infuriated to see this one more death but a few feet in front of him, that he lost his mind, his self-control. He took his sword and he, raging, ran at the beast and hacked and slashed and hacked deeper and deeper gouts into that thick hide, but still not deep enough to do any significant damage, to do more than scratch the damned monster. And the beast lowered its head and with its massive tusks picked up Arthur, Prince, King of the Britons, tossed him into the air like a rag doll, and he flew round and round and round and came smashing down upon the soil, blood spouting from his mouth, from his nose, and he lay there groaning. The dogs roared and howled, such as were left of them, and Cafall, king of the dogs, a great horse stallion of a dog, in his heart, saw red, saw that monstrous pig lumbering towards Arthur's prone form, towards the body of his beloved master. Great maw opened up, ready to bite the king's head off as he had severed the head of the other warrior. And Cafall raced forward, howling and yipping, a force to behold, bounded from a rock, leapt up and sank his teeth into the great ear of Tuathail. And though he was but a Jack Russell in size, he had the heart of a stallion and the weight of a stallion in that moment, and he pulled down as he sank and sank, teeth ripping and lacerating that massive great ear to ribbons. And the bull roared and howled and shook and staggered and tried to toss its head hither and yon to send the little dog flying, but the little dog held on, biting and chewing and swallowing down gobbets of pork and bacon to the last, and the pig staggered backwards, its eyes watering with rage and pain, and not paying attention to where it was going. And just as Arthur had lost his mind in attacking the pig, so the pig lost its mind in trying to fight off the dog and paid no heed to where it was, until there was a mighty crack and a snap, and the cliff edge began to crumble under the enormous bulk of the king of the pigs, and it staggered back, it stumbled, it scrabbled for purchase with its trotters, but the more it scrabbled, the more the cliff edge gave way, boulders and soil and rocks tumbling hither and yon, until the pig itself fell back, a gargantuan hill tumbling down the side of a mountain, head over heels, side over side, falling and falling and falling and falling. And at first the surviving warriors and wizards of Arthur's court were paralysed with shock. They stood and they watched in silence for a few moments until their hearts galvanised them, and they rushed cautiously towards the edge of that crumbling cliff and peered over. And there they saw, lying at the bottom, splattered, great jagged rocks piercing through its flesh, blood and guts and gizzards hither and yon at the base of the mountain. And there, the small black and brown dot that was Cafall, king of the dogs. The king of the wild boar was dead, and the king of the dogs was dead. The king of the Isle of the Mighty gurgled and coughed up blood, and the men and the wizards rushed to his side. And the wizards, the druids we should call them truly, worked their healing charms and potions and unguents, and restored the king to sufficient health that he could once again stand upon his own 2 feet. And he asked what had happened, and they told him. And he asked where his dog was, and they told him that Cafall had died to save him. And the king's heart broke, and no amount of magic, of spells, of potions could heal that break. But he asked one of the more able warriors to scramble down the side of the mountain to retrieve the body of the little dog. And of course the comb and scissors from betwixt the ears of the dead wild boar. And that warrior and Culhwch alongside him went down the side of the mountain, and a long and arduous journey it was, slipping and sliding and stumbling upon the crumbling mountainside until they came to the site. And there the warrior took the body of the fallen dog, and Culhwch took the comb and the scissors from betwixt the ears of the quite dead king of the wild boars, and back up the mountain they went. And whilst Culhwch kept the treasures needed for his future father-in-law, Arthur took the body of the little dog, and the tears streaming down his face, he laid it at the side of the mountain in Paris, at the site of Wulf. And he placed a great rock next to the body. And each of the warriors and the wizards that had survived, they too went and found a boulder. And as was the tradition of the day, they placed the boulders in a pile, a cairn, over the broken body of the little dog. And the surviving dogs, they nuzzled and pushed with their muzzles stones towards the cairn. And even the horses, with their great noses and hooves, pushed stones towards the cairn. And at length one of the warriors said, "Arthur, Arthur, look at this." And he picked up the great flat stone that they had all witnessed the little dog springboarding off in its final leap to bite deep into the ears of the king of the wild boar. And they all gathered round and they looked at that flat stone, that springboard. And whilst the stone was as hard as any stone might be, pressed within it, as if pressed into mud, soft and yielding, was the paw print of Cafall. For in that moment, that leap of bravery, that leap of victory, when the fierceness of his stallion heart was raging within him, perhaps the weight of his stallion heart gave him the strength not only to rip the king of the boar's ear to shreds, but to leave that imprint deep within that stone. And it was placed atop the cairn as a nameplate for what need of there is there for inscriptions when the dog himself has signed his own resting place. And in the years to come, stories went far and wide, and people would come and look at the cairn, and most of them paid their respects and left their own stones upon it. But some foolish souls, and we know what people are at times, some foolish souls decided they would take that flat rock with the paw print upon it and place it over their mantelpiece, or take it home to show their mothers or their wives or their sweethearts. And even as they took these home, the instant night fell, the stone would disappear from their possession. And the very next dawn, some other visitor, some other pilgrim going up the mountainside, would find it with the paw print atop the cairn. And there, for all we know, it remains to this day, a testament to a fierce heart in a little dog.